So you understand how difficult it is to run an organization, large organization like Argonne, with folks like him who work for you. It's just, it's always a joy. But actually, one of the slides that you showed prompts me actually to think of a couple of things to talk about, which were there. So you noticed there was a slide on light. Oh, sorry, that's right. Thank you. There was a slide that was shown about light, about the history of light, about trying to understand whether it was particle or wave. And there are two folks on there that I'd like to tell a story about, actually, because it's prompted by this. One is Al-Hazen, a very famous scholar, originally from Basra, and ended up at some point in Cairo, working for the Caliph. And he was actually set a problem which is really around science and society. Cairo has the Nile, and the Nile has floods, and it's kind of useful to know when the floods come, and preferably to control it. So as a piece of environmental engineering, it's the kind of thing we now try and do in Argonne, actually, is to think about these problems. The Caliph said, well, you're so smart, why don't you figure out how to control the floods on the Nile? Of course, he wasn't terribly successful with this. In those days, the penalty for failure was a bit different from what it is now. Now we're kind of allowed to fail and do things. And in fact, failure is supposed to be good. In those days, failure wasn't so good. So he was in deep trouble. And the way he got out of this was by feigning madness. As a theoretical physicist, this isn't very difficult to do, you understand. In consequence, he wasn't executed. He was simply confined to house arrest. However, the world should be very grateful for that, because under house arrest, he had nothing else to do but to write down everything that he knew about light.
It was on my slide.
It was, that's right. So the first textbook on light was published actually at about 1015, more or less 1,000 years ago. And that book, by the way, I think was a very large part of bringing the Renaissance in Italy a few centuries later, because, of course, the book, they understood Snell's law, diffraction, making of lenses, many very practical things about that, and it sort of found its way into Italy, turned its way into grinding of lenses, and then that led to telescopes and microscopes and everything we see today. There's a kind of an odd moral there, really. The main moral is that when you fund research, you don't necessarily get what you paid for. And maybe that's part of the point. And then the other one is exactly the same thing. There was another chap on there you may have seen, was Christian Huygens, who was a Dutch physicist around the 17th century, contemporary of Newton and others, who was a great experimentalist. And he was also given a research contract, this time actually by the British government, because they wanted accurate clocks. He was actually a very good experimentalist, and he built the most accurate clocks in time, and they picked on this guy. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society so that they could give him a research grant to make clocks. So, of course, he built clocks, but one of the things he did was to discover a phenomenon which is now known as the foundation of modern nonlinear dynamics. You talked about nonlinearities. And the reason this happened is that he built his clocks in pairs. He made two clocks. And the reason for making two is you try to make them absolutely identical. But then you know the accuracy of the clock because you time one against another, and that will give you some evidence about how accurate it is. And it's a lot easier for waiting for 24 hours and lining up with the sun. Now, he cut corners a bit and didn't have much wood around, apparently, so he made them together in the same common frame. And much to his surprise, he discovered that they, on occasion, kept exactly the same time. And so that they synchronized with each other and they locked. And that phenomenon of synchronization is actually the same phenomenon which you see in lasers, in superconductors, and actually in synchrotrons, because we use it to drive this. So this was a great discovery. And he reported that great discovery in a paper to the Royal Society, sent it in, and it was literally a letter in those days. You sent your letter, it was transmitted to London, and the fellows of the Royal Society met, and the paper was presented, and they discussed it. So it turns out that they weren't very impressed. They said, well, look, you're supposed to be making accurate clocks, and your clocks are so bad that one clock can influence the time of another clock. It appears he lost his funding at that point. And worse than that, actually, the Royal Society lost the paper, and it was stuck in the basement for about a century and wasn't published until about 1780 when somebody found it in a mouldering pile of papers. But nonetheless, an incredibly profound, important piece of work, actually driven by a goal which was initially very applied, and nonetheless ending up in a completely different direction from where it is. Now, I've used almost all of the time in my talk now, but never mind, I'll just... so let me run through a few things that I intended to say. Let me say a little bit about ARGONNE. So I'm director of ARGONNE National Lab. It's about 25 miles away. Some of you may know it. Some of you may be visiting it actually on Monday. The history of ARGONNE is actually nuclear power. Not so far from here. And in fact, if you walk 2 streets across and walk north a little bit, you'll see a sculpture, Henry Moore, on the side of the street. And that's the place where the first self-sustaining nuclear reaction was made in 1942 in the University of Chicago by Enrico Fermi and some of his friends. Following the war, ARGONNE was founded to exploit nuclear power for peaceful means and generated all of the first generation of nuclear reactors that are operating around the world, and it's still a large part of what we do. We're actually one of a whole group of national labs. Ooh, can't see that very well, never mind. ARGONNE is here, Fermi is there, but there are a number around the country. There are a lot of us. I like to point out that there are more physical scientists at ARGONNE than there are at the University of Chicago. We spend a lot of the government's money every year. And what do we do with it? Well, we do a number of things. One is that we are a science lab, but we're a science lab which is mission-driven and mission-oriented and looking for important contributions to society. And that involves us doing discovery science in a large number of areas in physics and computer science, materials and life sciences, but it's particularly driven by work in understanding energy technology. Nuclear we still do, mostly now on a computer. Renewable energy is a large part of our portfolio. I'll talk a little bit about batteries, and we also work on vehicles. We have a responsibility, as a national lab does actually, to work in national security, but I would say national security for us doesn't mean bombs. National security often means energy security, resilience, the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, in particular taking reactors and turning them into things that can't be weaponized. That was particularly important, some of you may know, associated with the Iran deal that was done to the Iran-Iraq reactor. And another thing that we do is we run large scientific facilities. We have the Advanced Photon Source, which at the moment is still the brightest hard X-ray source and certainly the most productive one, and this is Bertrand's baby. We do high-performance computing. We actually do nuclear physics, and we do some nanoscience. And actually, we do have collaborations with Turkey. I pulled this one up. So we actually have a lot of Turkish scientists at the lab, a lot of visitors at the lab, and perhaps just to make a point about these things for those of you who are elsewhere, if I can find the backspace. These user facilities are free to use. If you want to use the Advanced Photon Source, you simply have to write a proposal, get it through peer review, and then access to the machine is free with a great deal of help in how to use it. You don't have to come in the morning and switch it on. People know how to make that work. And this brings a very large number of scientists from across the world to work at the lab. We have 5,500 users every year coming to the Advanced Photon Source. Now, I do want to say a little bit about energy storage, and it's associated with transportation. This is really the only form of sustainable transportation that now exists on the planet. People will try and tell you otherwise. It is indeed sustainable because you can feed the donkey with the stuff which is on the back. It's, however, not the preferred method of transportation, because I'm sure that the folks who are riding there would prefer to be driving this. This is a very nice mode of transportation. It's fair to say at the moment that this isn't sustainable. And making this sustainable and making electric vehicles sustainable is important for us. At the core of electric vehicles, but also of many other things, is in fact electrical storage. If you have renewable power coming from solar or from wind, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, and rather than so that you have energy there, you need to store it and release it. And the most efficient and effective way of doing that would be with a battery. It's also the case that batteries are everywhere. Everybody around here is carrying a lot of modern technology in a battery. But it needs a revolution. Firstly, this thing, which is the Sony battery, which is in your phone, is already a $30 billion business, which is nice, but it's improving very slowly and it's not improving fast enough. And the way you can see it's not improving fast enough is that if you were to take your computer apart and say what's actually inside my computer, it's mostly battery. No, the smart bits have vanished out of sight and you can't see them anymore. And you know, everybody complains about battery life. No, the thing that actually stops mobile phone technology from moving is actually batteries. So it's actually a rather laggard technology. The next thing, of course, is that if you really wanted to use renewables, I talked about backing up of power. If you wanted to back up the US's power consumption for 12 hours, you have to store that energy somewhere. Well, if you have the Hoover Dam, here's the Hoover Dam. If you were to take the annual energy production 9 times that every 12 hours, that's what you'd need. Or alternatively, if you wanted to use those things, you'd need about 1,000 times the current annual production, and we'd like to do better than that. But the goal is really a transformative change. It's actually to get into banking. Because the purpose of the impact of energy storage is that you can actually turn electrons into a currency. You should be able to put them in and take them back. So that's what we're trying to do. And why is it difficult? Well, it needs money. I'm always intrigued actually by economists these days. They never talk about money. I'm a materials scientist, and in particular I'm a lab director, so I really care about money. If you look at what we've had with the technology revolution over the last century, we've got extraordinary things, but they're very expensive. So typical consumer electronics, if you buy it, it costs you about $1,000 a kilo. I mean, you don't typically buy consumer electronics that way, but it matters that you should. And by the way, it works for planes as well. The problem with these things is that this is fine if you don't need very many of them. But if you really want to do things at scale, you can't work with technologies that cost that much. You need something maybe that costs about as much as this. This is the scalable technology, cows. Comes in around $10 a kilo. And actually, vehicles, unless you're extravagant, come in at around the same price. Where does one want to get to, however, to get at scale? You need to be dealing with getting down to just the cost of the materials to run it. And so, if you're building things out of steel or aluminum, they're a few dollars a kilo. That's actually the cost of wheat. This is the most efficient energy technology we have. Comes in around $1 a kilo. And actually, if you buy a windmill, also comes in around the same price. And batteries, unfortunately, are 2 orders of magnitude off the pace. So, what are we doing about that? It turns out, actually, that the costs of batteries are beginning to go down. you'd like to, sorry you can't see the colors here, you'd like to get somewhere down here, and this is roughly the trend, and interestingly it's already running far ahead of predictions that were made a few years ago. Oh, thanks. Oh, I have a choice, and that's going to be difficult. I'm a theorist. Ah, there we go. Thanks. So this is really coming down, but we're trying to drive that very fast. And this is not the only technology that depends upon materials, which is important. So if you look at technologies which are actually going eventually to give us sustainability, photovoltaics, storage, electrical transmission, all of these, water purification, low power electronics, all of these are actually technologies which are driven by fundamental advances in material science. The ones down the bottom are easier because you don't need much of it and therefore you're prepared to spend more on it. And the ones up at the top get really hard because price matters. Okay? And one of the challenges we have is that if you just look at the world, you discover that aside from the electrical grid, which is the copper age, we don't actually have any large scalable electrical technologies which have been deployed on the scale of kilometers or tons. Because I took up too much of my own time at the top, I will just point out an aspect of what we do in this area. Of course, we have large programs working on electrical storage. They run all of the way from fundamental material science and fundamental chemistry right the way to applications. We make use of all of the tools we have, the high-energy synchrotrons, advanced computing, the ability to do scale-up chemistry, the ability to move all of the way through that chain and to work all of the way through industry. And that, of course, is a fundamental role of a lab, a national lab, as distinct from what you would do at a university. Universities have a lot of very smart cats, and we have an army. And if we can manage to get the army sufficiently energized and as smart as the cats, then we can achieve a lot. And the history, actually, of the lab system is that we've been able to do that. And I should stop there. Thank you very much.